intensa. Comenzamos hoy a la mañana con los grupos de trabajo y los laboratorios de idea. Continuamos con un muy merecido reconocimiento a quienes fueron las pioneras en hacerle lugar a la perspectiva de género y feminista en nuestra universidad, y un muy sentido homenaje a Olga Echeverría, quien no solo ha dejado una honda huella en Tandil y en nuestra universidad, sino también en todos quienes tuvimos el privilegio de ser sus estudiantes. También se desarrollaron mesas redondas y conversatorios que apuntaron a problematizar una diversidad de cuestiones, de problemáticas desde la perspectiva de los estudios de género, feministas y de sexualidades. A mí me toca ahora presentar la conferencia con la que vamos a cerrar este día, por lo menos virtualmente, porque va a haber algunas actividades artísticas y culturales que se van a hacer de forma presencial en las distintas sedes que pueden encontrar en el programa. Y esta conferencia se denomina Teorías del Sur, estudios de género y políticas del conocimiento, y está a cargo de la profesora Raewyn Connell, a quien queremos agradecer por el entusiasmo y la predisposición a participar en este diálogo entre sures que le propusimos cuando la contactamos para pensar este espacio. Raewyn Connell es profesora emérita de la Universidad de Sydney y miembro vitalicia de la Unión Nacional de Educación Terciaria. Es autora de obras clave como Género y Poder, Masculinidades y Teoría del Sur. Su trabajo ha sido traducido en 22 idiomas y ha participado activamente del movimiento de trabajadores y ha trabajado por la igualdad de género y la paz. Ahora vamos a escuchar la conferencia que fue grabada anticipadamente para poder subtitularla y de este modo hacer el intercambio más fluido. Y posteriormente vamos a contar con la presencia de la autora para conversar sobre las preguntas o los comentarios que puedan ir surgiendo y que les invitamos a ir compartiendo por el chat del YouTube. Así que, Pir, si te parece, podés dar compartir pantalla y empezamos con la conferencia.
Greetings from Australia. I'm Raewyn Connell, and I'm very, very pleased to be with you. There's not very much communication usually between Argentina and Australia. We don't get much of your news, and I suppose you do not get much of ours. But there is an interesting shared history of over a long period of time through the history of colonization, economic development, despite the differences of language and landscape. We do have some things in common. Among them, our own histories of gender patterns, which are by no means simply identical with a global North style Western model of gender. So let me start by showing you one quite well-known image of Australia, painted by a very well-known Australian artist half a century ago. If I can now, no, it doesn't allow me. We'll have to remove this. There. Now, why did that? Okay, anyway, this is a painting known as The Drover's Wife. And it's an image of, I guess, a certain kind of gender construction and gender relations related to the itinerant workforce of the colonial frontier in outback Australia, much of which is desert or arid, and which produced a certain pattern of gender subordination, gender representation in a very male-dominated situation of economic marginality. And I suspect there are similar kinds of images or folk memories of the developing pastoral frontier in Argentina. So we do have some kind of connection, and I hope in the story that I want to tell about gender studies, there will be recognizable things for you. For me, the concern about research and debate on gender goes back to the 1970s. Here is an image, and I will now attempt again to change. No, that didn't work. Let me try this. Yes. Okay, that's the way I've got to do it. Sorry, you'll have to cut that bit out. But here's an image of the International Women's Day in Australia in 1975, the same year as the first World Congress on Women that was held in Ciudad Mexico. And as you can see, the styles have changed, but the concerns are still there. The Women's Abortion Action Campaign was one of the leading movements within the women's liberation movements in Australia. Now, my argument is that the women's movements of the world launched what amounts to a revolutionary transformation in intellectual life, introducing new perspectives, new concerns, and critiques of all existing bodies of knowledge. But I would also argue that that revolution that was launched in that generation is still unfinished, that we are still working to see the consequences of this coming through in science, including the social sciences where I work, in religion, in art. We are still grappling with the products of centuries, many centuries, of patriarchal authority and patriarchal dominance of the production of knowledge. And yet, that revolution is active. It involved, as Beata Kirkwood argued in Chile a generation ago, the creation of a new historical subject as women collectively became an active political presence and an active cultural presence, including in institutions of knowledge such as universities. And with that came new agendas of research and theorizing, addressing problems which had sometimes surfaced in patriarchal culture before, but were now redesigned, restated, and expanded. And also new concepts for the social sciences, the humanities, and as the argument spread, other fields of knowledge before than there were before. So we're dealing with a very large, very powerful, but also very messy, I suppose one would say, cultural and intellectual change, which works in different ways in different parts of the world and in different fields of knowledge, but also can have quite a dramatic effect in changing areas such as my field of sociology, where gender research from the 1970s through to the 1990s, I suppose, became the largest single area of research in the discipline of sociology. It's quite a dramatic generational change from what had been a very marginal area of knowledge to an absolutely central concern of the discipline. And that has, perhaps without quite so much drama, also happened in other areas of the humanities and social sciences. So out of that has come newly named areas of knowledge like gender studies, queer theory, feminist theory. Out of that has come, as I try to suggest in some of my more recent work, such as this book, a conceptual language of gender regimes and gender orders, of dynamic change within patterns of gender, of the plurality of masculinities and femininities, the hierarchy, patterns of hegemony in gender relations, and of course patterns of contradiction in gender relations and struggles for change, including the continuing restructure. Gender is never a fixed social and cultural pattern, but is always open to restructuring and change, sometimes in the cause of light and justice, sometimes not. And we have seen in our own generation economic restructuring, which has reshaped, for instance, the gender divisions of labour. Here is an image of a factory in northern Mexico, which is involved in the production of clothing for export to especially to the markets of North America, the maquila economy, which is developed in those parts of the world very much affected by the new regime of transnational movement, transnational capital, bulk transport, and so forth, which is built on old patterns of the gender division of labour, where most clothing manufacturing was in the hands of women, but now moved into factories under the control of new forms of capital, which are largely in the hands of men. So we have a reconstruction without a revolution in quite a large area of the gender division of labour. And that kind of change can be traced in different forms in many parts of the world. So we're dealing with a very dynamic area of culture and social life, which often moves faster than our knowledge, our tools of knowledge can handle, and therefore there is necessarily also turbulence in the arena of knowledge and debate over what kinds of concepts, research techniques, publication and dissemination of knowledge are adequate to catch up with the moving realities of gender relations in the world. And gender studies and the gender research that occurs in disciplines of social science, humanities, and natural sciences, as in all knowledge, all areas of knowledge, can make errors, can make mistakes in trying to interpret the gender relations of the world. And here I want to point particularly, and this would be central to my argument today, to an argument made by a North African feminist, Mania Lazreg, about a generation ago, published quite important articles which argued that feminist scholarship, as it circulated then in the Francophone and Anglophone worlds particularly, had made a significant error in the way it constructed the concepts of patriarchy, of feminism, of gender struggle. The result of this error, which basically took the gender experience of the global north as the pattern for understanding gender in all parts of the world, including Africa, meant that feminists in the global south, and Mani Al-Azraq was talking particularly about Algeria, but the argument applies, I think, everywhere. Feminists in the global south, in effect, had to fight two struggles to develop the tools to deal with their own reality. One was the struggle, of course, with patriarchal power in their own societies, with the entrenched power of men and the cultural supports of that power. But also they had to fight a struggle with feminism from the global north, which had a hegemonic position in the world as a whole, but whose ideas did not necessarily illuminate the real situation of women, men, and all groups in global south contexts. Now that, I think, was a very penetrating observation, and it's one that I've thought about a lot and come in contact with people wrestling with that kind of issue in various parts of the world. It is, in fact, a systematic problem in the whole economy of knowledge, that there are massive global inequalities in authority and power within the sciences, within the humanities, within our projects of knowledge. So, you know, all of us, wherever we are in the world, if we're connected with radical movements in the terrain of gender, if we're connected, if we're working in any way with feminist theory. We've all heard of Simone de Beauvoir. We've all, you know, probably most of us have read The Second Sex. And you know, we've also read Gender Trouble. We all know of the authors of texts like that. But how many of us, even around the global south, know the work of Bina Agarwal or Amina Mama, who I think are profoundly important feminist theorists, but whose work comes from different parts of the global south, and whose names are absolutely not as well known as Judith Butler or Simone de Beauvoir. Now, this is not just a problem in feminism. This is a problem in the structure of intellectual life on a global scale. Now, I want to illustrate this with a map of the world, which was devised by a couple of clever British geographers just a few years ago, who made this map of the world showing the different countries of the world with an area proportional not to their land area or their population, but proportional to the number of academic journals that they publish. And you can see the result, that the great majority of the academic journals in the world are published in the global north, predominantly in the Anglophone global north, in the United States and Britain, but also in other parts of Western Europe. And the rest of the world basically is nowhere. You can see how South America, Latin America fits into this. You can see how Australia and Aotearoa New Zealand fit into this. This pattern changes somewhat. China has become more important as a publisher in very recent years. But if you think about authority and influence in the intellectual world, this map is important, and it's particularly important because the color of the countries represents the citation rate of the different journals. The darker the blue, the higher the average citation rate of the journals published in that country. So you can see the point. Not only are there more journals published in the global north, but they have more influence over the different disciplines. This is across all disciplines, I might say, this map. So here you've got a strong representation, the kind of evidence that is now coming from a good deal of research on global patterns in the production and circulation of knowledge, of the hegemony of the global north in all fields of knowledge. And that, of course, applies to gender research. So what I'm going to do now is suggest how this can be corrected. What needs to be recognized and circulated if we are to correct the intellectual imbalances that gender theory and feminist thought have faced in the past. And the first thing, I suppose, is to recognize the global scale of feminist movements in the South, in the global South as a whole. And you will be familiar with the story in South America. Let me also mention the histories, for instance, in the Arab world, where many people in the Anglophone world don't even know that any feminist movements ever existed there. But here is a picture from about 100 years ago, at the time of what is called in the Anglophone story, the first wave feminism. This is Huda Sharawi from Egypt, who was the founder of a feminist movement of significance in Egypt about 100 years ago. And that can be matched to a feminist awakening in China, the feminist movements in India, women's organizations, pro-feminist work by male intellectuals in India. It's very interesting. There was a women's presence in anti-colonial movements in just about every part of the world that was involved in resistance to colonialism. And so it goes on. There is a wide swathe of history there from which we can draw inspiration and ideas. And that had its intellectual side too. Huda Sharawi was a writer, and there were many others in the colonized and post-colonial world who developed critiques and analyses of gender relations in colonial societies and their own perspectives on gender relations, which sometimes drew from feminist thought in the global north, sometimes developed along different lines. For instance, there is an important line of thought from different parts of the colonial and post-colonial world, which has looked at colonization, indeed imperialism itself, as a gendered structure, as a gendered historical phenomenon. It wasn't simply the case that, that imperialism descended and gender then appeared. Imperialism impacted on gender relations of a very wide variety of kinds in the colonized world and reshaped the societies that were colonized, sometimes with enormous violence, sometimes with less, but always producing new social patterns, including new forms of masculinity and femininity, new patterns of gender relations. One of the very interesting writers about this is Ashish Nandi, a public intellectual from India, cultural critic, psychologist, historian, very interesting writer, who is in fact one of the pioneers of critical studies of masculinity, and who wrote extraordinarily interesting work on the construction of masculinity in the colonial society, with the impact of colonization on indigenous Indian ideas of manhood and masculinity. Nandi points out that it was not only the colonized whose gender patterns changed under imperialism, but also the imperialists themselves. That is, European patterns of masculinity were affected also, if you like, by the blowback of empire, even at the height of imperialism. I'd also mention, thinking in this area, Amina Mama, an important feminist thinker from Central Africa, who worked in Southern Africa, and the United States, and so forth, who's argued of the importance of colonial violence, of the violence of colonization, in creating the conditions for high levels of gendered violence in the resulting colonial societies. She argues that there's a continuity between the process of colonization and its violent reconstruction of social order with the contemporary problems of violence in gender relations and the consequences for instance, the HIV/AIDS epidemic, for the reshaping of economic relations, and so on. So that's one kind of area where I think the thought of the global South in gender relations is of immense importance and should be understood by the global North as well. Another thing which thinkers from the global South did, I think in a very distinctive way, is construct what I would call regional gender sociologies and histories. Here I'm thinking of the work of people like Teresita de Barbieri, whose work I'm sure some of you will know, who produced in a synthesis of sociological reasoning about gender and the historical thinking about on a continental scale, about the formation of the gender order in colonial and then post-colonial societies. What I think is a unique social analysis of gender. It's something that I have been inspired by in my own thinking about gender relations, and which I know no analog of in the work of the global North. So thinkers like that, I think, should be an important part of the worldwide history of feminist thought. Then there is the area of analysis that concerns land. Land is, in a way, what imperialism was about. The occupation of land was simply a central part of imperial conquest and colonization. It's interesting that land hardly figures in European social theory, and it's not just feminist theory, but European theory at all. You won't find much about land. But land was, of the essence in the colonized societies, for instance, in indigenous society in Australia, so that the central form of indigenous politics in my country has actually been the land rights movement. And it's striking to me to see, for instance, the importance of the landless peoples movement in Brazil, the significance of forms of land ownership in the Andean countries, and so forth. Now here, there is powerful conceptual work which has been done by feminist thinkers in the Global South. So I want to introduce here the work of Bina Agarwal from India, who's known as a development economist. He's also, I think, a very important feminist theorist. He's worked on gender and economics for many years and wrote a magnificent book called A Field of One's Own about women's rights and access to land and uses of land across South Asia. It's a magnificent piece of research which deals with property rights, with law, with politics, with environment, with agricultural development, social conflict, the state. It's all in there. It's an extraordinary piece of feminist thinking, which I regard as, you know, one of the modern masterpieces of feminist thought. And I strongly recommend to anyone who's interested in Southern theories of gender as a very important text. Finally, there's extremely creative thinking from the Global South about the kinds of alliances that might arise in gender politics, which is, I think, a very important theme in feminist struggles and the struggles of other groups for change in gender relations. This is Kopano Ratele, a psychologist from South Africa, one of the most interesting writers about questions of masculinity in any part of the world today, who's written extraordinarily interesting work about race in relation to race relations, in relation to construction of masculinity, about tradition, which of course is a major rhetorical theme in a lot of gender politics. He argues we have to be aware that tradition is not just patriarchal, that there are democratic and positive traditions about masculinities and femininities, as well as the patriarchal traditions. That traditions themselves are negotiable, and they are indeed constantly being negotiated in the present. So again, I think are well worth knowing about. So we have a wealth of resources in the intellectual work of feminists and other groups involved in gender politics around the post-colonial world, which we should access and should be able to access to enrich our understanding of life in the post-colonial world, and combine with the rich resources that the global north gives us to understand the real dynamics of gender today. Now, of course, those realities involve some fairly tough politics. There are blowbacks. There is resistance to democratic change in gender relations. There are anti-feminist movements. And there are threats to the gains which women's movements, gay movements, trans movements have achieved in their struggles over the last generation. There are counter trends, that is to say, and we need to recognize them. the advent of neoliberalism, the restructuring of economies under the aegis of global finance has had a gender dimension. It has weakened the public sector in many parts of the world, on which women tended to rely more than men did for income and for social resources. So the weakening of the state in some parts of the world has had a gender dimension. In other parts of the world, of course, the state has been strengthened, nowhere more than in China. The rise of the Chinese dictatorship has recently involved a weakening of feminist movements in that country, the removal from mass media of progressive voices in gender relations, and even the use of police powers against radical groups in gender relations. So there is a backlash happening in China at the moment. I show you the picture of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party to suggest the presence, if you like, of an old-style patriarchy in that case. The growth of precarity in economic terms around the world, the growth of the climate disaster, all of those have gender dimensions that we have to reckon with. The growth of nationalist populism, the recurrence of strongman politics in various parts of the world, the advent of people like Bolsonaro, Trump, the increasingly authoritarian regimes of Eastern Europe. These are all things that we have to take into account, to reckon with. We have to reckon with the advent of, or the revival of forms of religious bigotry, the anti-gender campaigns that have come out of the Catholic Church, the evangelical churches, or some of them at least. These also are problems for progressive movements. But there are, at the same time, gains and new departures. And I want to finish with thinking about paths forward in gender analysis, in the intellectual work that has to be part of social movements for gender equality and gender democracy. About 20 years ago, a colleague of mine in Australia, a sociologist, feminist sociologist called Chilla Bulbeck, who had specialized in the study of global feminism. From her work, I've learned a great deal. About 20 years ago, Chilla published this book called Reorienting Western Feminisms, which has a certain humor in the title, referring to the idea of Orientalism as a problem in global intellectual relations. In that book, Chilla addresses the question of how we can relate feminist thinking, which arises in different historical contexts and different cultural backgrounds. Can we speak across cultural difference? And her answer, although she's conscious of the immense difficulties and the obstacles that are created by the kind of global hegemony of the global north that I was speaking before, which is sometimes expressed in the form of racism, of white supremacy and white privilege, excuse me, in many parts of the world. She nevertheless is optimistic about the possibility of connection and communication a cross-cultural difference. If this is done with care, with courtesy, with a willingness to invest in mutual learning, exchange across boundaries. It's what she calls braiding across the border, picking up the image of a traditional form of women's art. And that, I think, is both a thoughtful and inspiring contribution, which suggests ways forward of linking, for instance, the curriculum in programs of gender studies around the world through exchange of materials, of pedagogical methods, and so forth, around along, if you like, south-south connections, which are indeed being built as we talk. That is not the only kind of intellectual work that has to be done. I think it is a mistake to think that we can simply de-link from the global north in anger about the hegemony of the global north. The feminists and progressive movements of the global north have also produced resources that are of value. I don't resile from learning from the work of Simone de Beauvoir and the many followers. They are of value to us, but we have to negotiate with them. We have to think through the conditions in which global north ideas and methods have been produced, and work to produce forums which operate in different ways, which can produce counter-hegemony and more democratic and equal exchange. So we need ultimately cooperative models of intellectual development and struggle. We need to, I think, to use the international forums that are available, problematic as they often are, but forums like the United Nations agencies, UN Women, the World Health Organization, UNESCO, and so forth as means of exchange. We need to use international union organization, another a kind of agency which exists to connect the less powerful in the economic world. We need to use academic arenas where those are available. We need to exchange tactics, organizational techniques, and the like, and eventually produce a world of mutual support rather than the division and anger and antagonism, which is so much a part of mainstream politics today. So I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you about these issues. I feel this connection is part of the kind of thing we need to be doing in the future on a large scale. And so I'm really delighted to have this chance of connection now. Thank you. And I will now show my final slide for those of you who might have been taking notes with the names of the people that I have been mentioning. Thank you.
Bueno, Vir, si querés dejar de... Ay, joya. Bárbaro. Bueno, ahora con la presencia de la profesora Connell acá, vamos a aprovechar este espacio y esta oportunidad para compartir inquietudes, preguntas, comentarios respecto de la contundente exposición que acabamos de escuchar. Yo por ahí, para romper el hielo, tengo una pregunta que en realidad ya es algo que en algún momento le pregunté a Raewyn por mail y estuvimos intercambiando respecto a eso, que tiene que ver con el rol el lugar del Estado en estas disputas y luchas de los movimientos feministas y de los colectivos de la diversidad y la disidencia sexual, eh, atendiendo también a este backlash del que hablaba ella, a estos movimientos de resistencia y de oposición a los avances en torno a las políticas de género y de sexualidad, ¿no? Me interesa saber, ella hace algún tiempo publicó un artículo muy importante para quienes trabajamos en el CISOC, que lo hemos leído bastante, donde recuperaba los desarrollos de la teoría de género para pensar al Estado, y quisiera saber si en este contexto y a partir de las reflexiones que ella colocó, tiene alguna, digo, puede ofrecer alguna revisión o algunas formas de repensar ese lugar que el Estado ha ocupado tanto para los movimientos como para la teoría feminista. Y mientras tanto, les invitamos a que sigan compartiendo sus preguntas o comentarios por el chat de YouTube.
So thank you, Professor Connell, for being with us tonight and for presenting all of this knowledge with us. To begin with, I would like to make a question. So you talked about the role of states in the feminist and queer movements related to backlash, and we talked by email about it, and we discussed about this briefly. I would like to ask, in relation to an article you wrote recently and that we've read here at university, how would you relate the theory of gender and state, and how would we rethink the role of state related to the progress of feminism and queer movements?
Well, that's a very complicated issue, indeed. That's a good academic answer, isn't it? Always recognize the complications. I think of the state as we know it historically as a gendered institution. I don't think that can be evaded. States have historically been dominated by men and patriarchal interests, though it has been possible, especially as state structures were partially democratized, for oppositional movements and concepts of gender justice and gender equality to enter into the ideas that circulate in the state, and to some extent into the practices of states. In Australia, back in the 1970s, the women's movement pioneered a political strategy which came to be called the Femocrat strategy, which meant that we had, through the means of a reforming Labor government, a cadre of feminist bureaucrats were created, who then used state powers and state mechanisms to introduce social reforms, for instance, funding women's health centres, funding refuges for victims of domestic violence, putting resources into curriculum change in schools, which had been very sexist, and which were then reconstructed by a new generation of feminist teachers. we thought of that as, to quote a colleague and friend of mine, Hester Eisenstein, who was herself a Femocrat, as a kind of feminist judo technique of achieving results with by using the power of the state, in a sense, against its own patriarchal history. Now, that had some important gains. I think that was a very successful strategy in areas like health and education, and resulted in...
I will interrupt you so that I
Oh,
can
sorry,
translate
yes,
chunk.
yes, of course, sorry.
Es un tema complicado, realmente este tema académico es muy complicado, pero lo que sí puedo decir es que para mí el Estado es una institución de género histórica y esta relación no se puede evadir. Históricamente el Estado siempre estuvo dominado por los hombres y por el patriarcado. Ahora, por suerte, hay una especie de democratización y esto permite que haya movimientos opositores, permitiendo que dentro del Estado se pueda observar movimientos de igualdad y justicia de género en algunas políticas del Estado, aunque no todas. Por ejemplo, en Australia, en los años 70, se estableció lo que se conocía como la estrategia femocrática, que en un gobierno del pueblo, estas femocráticas utilizaron mecanismos del Estado para, para poder, usaron mecanismos del Estado para poder hacer cambios en las instituciones del gobierno. Por ejemplo, usaron mecanismos como fundaciones para ayudar a mujeres refugiadas, otras fundaciones para las víctimas de género. También ayudaron a reformar los programas de la escuela, en las escuelas que históricamente eran programas relacionados a temas masculinos o al patriarcado. Una de mis colegas, Esther Einstein, que también se considera una demócrata, describió este tema como un judo feminista en el que se usa el poder del Estado para poder combatir contra el Estado. Y para mí eso es un éxito.
Thank you. Just to conclude very briefly, I think the politics through the state is in some sense necessary, but it is also vulnerable. So some of those programs were then later closed down by right-wing governments, by reactionary governments. And indeed, our current government has used the power of the state effectively against the interests of women in a number of ways. So, there is a constant struggle that goes on in that arena. But I would argue that the state is an important arena for progressive gender politics. We cannot afford to abandon that arena, though it is certainly not sufficient in itself. And gains in the state depend on the existence of social movements in other forums, which can put pressure on governments for good policies and laws.
Creo que la política a través del Estado es necesaria, pero también es vulnerable. El poder del Estado, por ejemplo, el gobierno actual, ha tomado medidas en contra de las mujeres. Es por eso que considero que el Estado es un estadio muy grande, pero no es suficiente. Depende del Estado ayudarnos, pero también hay otras organizaciones no gubernamentales que son fundamentales para poner presión al Estado y que se puedan tomar las medidas necesarias para que los movimientos feministas puedan florecer.
Okay.
Ahí en el chat de YouTube van surgiendo algunas preguntas. Si querés, Suyai, te las paso. Mercedes dice, en continuidad con la pregunta que hacía yo, qué rol le cabe a las universidades como usinas de reproducción de la colonialidad del saber y qué aportes pueden realizar los feminismos decoloniales.
So there are some questions in YouTube, and the first question is by Mercedes, related to Matthias' questions. What is the role of universities as reproduction of colonial knowledge, and what advantages do you think? What advantages and accomplishments do you think that decolonial feminism has achieved?
Right, two very interesting issues. Universities, like the state, are a field of struggle. They have been, I think, quite important for feminism and at least moderately important for gay liberation, gay movements, in circulating ideas, in conducting research, in influencing policy, even against the intentions of university managers or the governments that are responsible for universities. Universities can be a site of subversion.
Las universidades son un campo de lucha, pero son muy importantes para el movimiento gay, porque permiten que circulen las ideas y la investigación en este campo. También permitió influenciar políticas contra las intenciones de las personas a cargo. Sin embargo, y como ustedes ya saben, las universidades son espacios subversivos en los que no solo se cuestiona el Estado, sino también el status quo.
But universities are tied into the, if you like, the neo-imperial global economy of knowledge, and circulate mainly the forms of knowledge that are authorized by elite institutions in the global north, like Harvard University, Oxford and Cambridge, and so forth. So it's important to push back against that for knowledge workers in the global south to not, as I was suggesting, not de-link, but negotiate different relationships with the hegemonic institutions in the global north.
Como ustedes saben, en este tipo de universidades lo que nosotros recibimos es el saber neoimperial y lo que circula es saber del norte global en universidades de élite, como por ejemplo Harvard. Es importante contestar con trabajos del sur global. Es importante negociar y no luchar para crear nuevas relaciones.
In relation to decolonial feminism, if we take a broad view of that as forms of feminism that are generated in colonial society or post-colonial society and assert their own autonomy and their local relevance, if we take that as the meaning of decolonial feminism, then there's immensely rich resources there, including the work of all of the people that I've mentioned. There is a rich history of feminist movements outside the universities, around the global south, which we should celebrate, we should know about, which should become part of the history of the field.
En cuanto al feminismo decolonial, sí, le doy una mirada amplia. Yo puedo decir que la sociedad postcolonial, en la sociedad postcolonial tenemos que tener en cuenta la relevancia local de muchos de los autores que yo mencioné. Hay muchísimos recursos, incluidas los autores que están en las diapositivas, y tenemos que tener en cuenta que hay mucha historia feminista fuera de las universidades. Esta historia es importante que la celebremos, que la sepamos y que formemos parte de esta historia también.
If we take a rather more specific view of decolonial feminism as particularly the positions of indigenous communities often in a situation of great oppression, such as indigenous communities in Australia, then the issues look rather different. Australian Aboriginal women have generally been critical of mainstream feminism in our country, which they see as growing out of white settler colonialism, of white experience, and as failing to break out of established racism.
Si le damos una mirada más específica a lo que yo venía diciendo, nos podemos fijar en el problema de las comunidades indígenas, en especial en cuanto a la opresión. Por ejemplo, en Australia tenemos problemas distintos. Las mujeres aborígenes australianas critican mucho al movimiento feminista porque lo ven como colonialismo de blancos, lo ven como un problema que surge de la gente blanca y que realmente no los afecta. Entonces, si ellas apoyan este feminismo, están rechazando su propia raza.
I should mention there Aileen Morton Robinson, an Aboriginal woman who wrote a well-known book called Talking Up to the White Woman, recently republished, in fact, which articulates this critique and which is difficult reading for white feminists, but important. Now that critique of feminism and the attempt to find other ways forward for Aboriginal women does not yet have a large international presence, but it does have some, and it is worth attention and worth learning, important to learn from.
Si les doy un ejemplo, les presento a Aileen Morton Robinson, que escribió un libro que se llama Talking Up to the White Woman, en español, hablándole a la mujer blanca, que es una crítica al feminismo. Es difícil de leer para las feministas blancas, porque lo que propone es, la autora, es encontrar otras formas de feminismo, otras formas de luchar para las mujeres aborígenes. Es un libro que se reeditó hace poco y que, si bien no tiene mucha presencia en el sur global, es una lectura importante y fundamental.
Thank you.
Bien, ahí otra pregunta que me hicieron llegar. Algunas personas están teniendo dificultades para hablar por el chat del YouTube por la necesidad de la suscripción, así que Verónica Mesque me hizo llegar una pregunta por WhatsApp que tiene que ver con cuál es la opinión de la profesora Connell respecto de los movimientos de varones y de los colectivos de varones que politizan la masculinidad. Sabemos que estos colectivos no son novedosos, pero sin embargo han tenido cierta relevancia y han dado lugar a algunos debates y polémicas respecto de cómo el feminismo se vincularía con estos colectivos de varones y cómo repensar el concepto de masculinidad hegemónica a la luz de estos desarrollos.
So we have another question, and that is, what is your opinion about male movements? We know that these male movements have politicized masculinity. We would like to know, what do you think about the relationship of these all-male movements with the feminist movements, and how we can rethink the idea of masculinity?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And of course, these are issues I have thought about a lot. All male movements of a reactionary kind, that is asserting men's special position and privileges, are in general terms not very powerful, and that they have not mostly been very popular. And I think a main reason for that is that they are in some sense unnecessary. The institutions of the world, the corporations, the legal system, the political system in almost all countries already represent the interests of men as a group. Of course, privileged men most, but nevertheless men as a group. So you don't need a popular movement in order to sustain patriarchal position.
Es una pregunta muy interesante. Estos movimientos, en los que son todos hombres, son movimientos reaccionarios, en los que quieren imponer los privilegios del hombre. No son poderosos ni populares, son más bien innecesarios. Si uno mira las instituciones como son el gobierno, el poder judicial o las compañías, están todas lideradas por hombres. Y si bien representan a una élite, representan a los hombres en general. Entonces son innecesarios, ya que no necesitan una lucha para ser representados.
Nevertheless, small movements can be threatening and dangerous, and there are some of those small men's movements which turn towards violence and become a kind of terrorist fringe, which is quite frightening. More interesting to me are the men's groups which struggle against patriarchy. And these have existed since the 1970s, to my knowledge. And some of them have quite a long continuous history. For instance, in India, there's a group called Men Against Violence, and so, which has existed for 20 years or so continuously, maybe more than that now, and which has maintained an anti-sexist program for all that time.
Lo que a mí más me preocupa son los pequeños movimientos, que hay bastantes lamentablemente porque son peligrosos, son una amenaza. Estos pequeños movimientos tienden a ser violentos y hasta se los considera terroristas. Sin embargo, lo que más me interesa hablar a mí son de aquellos movimientos en los que son hombres contra la patriarquía. Según me consta, más o menos a partir del año 1970 es cuando estos movimientos surgen, y desde esa década siempre tuvieron una historia continua. Por ejemplo, en India está el movimiento Men Against Violence, hombres contra la violencia, que existe hace más o menos 20 años, o quizás un poco más, y que tienen un programa estricto contra la violencia.
There is now an international network of groups of that kind from Latin America, from Africa, from South Asia, from other parts of the world. It's called Men Engage, and it's easy to find online if you do an online search for that as a single word, men, MENENGAGE, and that will put you in touch with hundreds of anti-patriarchy groups around the world. Many of them are mixed groups involving both men and women, but they center on work with men to contest violence, to contest patriarchal models of masculinity, and propose more engaged fatherhood, more equal domestic life, and of course economic equality for women and men.
Ahora hay una red internacional en la que hay distintos pequeños movimientos de Latinoamérica, África, Asia, de todo el mundo, que se llama Men Engaged. Lo pueden buscar online, se escribe MENENGAGED. Si lo buscan como una palabra, lo van a encontrar y van a ver que hay cientos de grupos antipatriarcales alrededor del mundo. Hay muchos de estos grupos que son mixtos, es decir, de hombres y mujeres, pero se centran en los hombres contra la violencia y contra el modelo patriarcal de masculinidad. También se centran en cuanto a modelos económicos igualitarios y a la paternidad.
Bárbaro. Bueno, yo quisiera hacer una última pregunta para no abusar del tiempo que nos ha dado muy amablemente la profesora Connell, y mientras tanto, si alguien quiere agregar alguna cuestión por el chat, puede hacerlo. Y tiene que ver con mis propios intereses, y con algo que la profesora Connell ha trabajado también muy exhaustivamente, que es el lugar de la escuela, ¿no? En la construcción de determinados órdenes de género. Cómo pensar en estos nuevos contextos y de la mano de los desafíos de los que fuimos hablando, cuál es el rol de la escuela y de la educación pública en particular. Y particularmente me interesaría saber qué rol le puede caber a la educación sexual en pensar modelos más igualitarios de relación promovidos de estas instituciones educativas.
So my last question, because I don't want to abuse the time you've already given us so generously, is what is the role of school to as regards gender roles? Particularly, I would like to know what is the role of public education as regards this, and what is the role of sex education towards generating a more equal approach to gender?
Right. Well, I'm an educator. I have been a professor of education at the university, involved in the training in the education of teachers. So this is a topic I have a great interest in and have thought a lot about. I think the school is an important context or arena in which children learn about gender. It's not the only arena. There's also the family, the neighborhood, the mass media are also important. But the school is a structured environment, and children necessarily learn about gender in the school context. So it really matters for their experience to be good and educationally productive, rather than rigid and authoritarian.
Como ya saben, yo soy una educadora, trabajé en la universidad, es más, me dedicaba a entrenar a otros profesores, entonces estoy muy interesada en este tema y es un tema en el cual yo pensé mucho y medité sobre ello. La escuela es un contexto importante para aprender de género, pero no es el único contexto. También hay otros lugares en los que se puede aprender, como por ejemplo en la familia, en tu barrio, en los medios de comunicación. Lo que sí provee la escuela es un ambiente estructurado en donde los niños aprenden de género. Lo importante es que la experiencia al aprender de género sea una experiencia buena y productiva, no estructurada y rígida.
I have a particular concern for public schools because that is where the bulk of working class children will gain their formal education. And there, I think, would pay particular attention to the role of teachers, who, are models of adult conduct for children, as well as being the transmitters, if you like, of the curriculum. So gender equality among the teaching workforce is an important part of education, and of the kind of world that we create for children to learn in. And I therefore very strongly support the role of teachers' unions and feminist campaigns among teachers to create gender equality in the sector.
Una preocupación muy grande que tengo es el rol de la escuela pública, porque es el lugar donde los niños de la clase trabajadora en general asisten. Por eso para mí es importantísimo el rol de las maestras, que son modelos de conducta y son transmisores de conocimiento. Es importante que ellos sepan sobre el género y que sepan crear un mundo para los niños que sea interesante y que ellos puedan aprender. Es por eso que yo estoy a favor de los gremios de docentes que también generan más equidad en cuanto a cuestiones de género.
About sex education, I think that, sexuality, sexual experience, sexual identity, and so forth is an important part of our social life. And it's therefore something that children need to learn about, and generally do learn about, often from, fairly, bad sources, such as pornography on the internet. I think a good sex education is a very important part of schooling. And by good sex education, I mean not just honesty about the biological process of human reproduction. That is important. That is part of what we have to do as teachers, but also the emotional and relationship aspect of sexuality needs to be part of a good sex education curriculum, because that is a major part of our social experience. The trouble is, of course, that sexuality is a highly emotional area of human life, and sex education is vulnerable to reactionary campaigns on grounds that often claim to be religious to restrict the content of sex education and basically censor the curriculum. I think that is an educational disaster where sex education is constrained and constricted, is weakened, and that is very, very sad where that happens.
La educación sexual es muy importante porque la experiencia sexual, la sexualidad, la identidad sexual es importantísima. Y los niños la aprenden eventualmente durante su vida, en general, por fuentes que no son tan buenas, como por ejemplo la pornografía en Internet. Una buena manera de aprender sobre la sexualidad y que para mí es importantísimo es la honestidad en cuanto a la honestidad biológica de cómo es el proceso de reproducción, y como docentes tenemos que prestar mucha atención a esto porque es parte de nuestro trabajo. Pero también creo que lo más importante es hablar sobre el aspecto emocional y las relaciones, ya que son parte fundamental de la vida social humana. Sin embargo, al ser humanos, la educación sexual es muy emocional, y es por esto que la educación sexual es vulnerable, ya que está sujeta a oposiciones de motivos religiosos, por lo general por ciertos movimientos reaccionarios, que restringen el contenido y finalmente la censuran. Para mí es un desastre, ya que debilitan a la educación sexual y hacen que el sistema esté comprimido.
So honesty and comprehensiveness are the principles for sex education, but that applies to other parts of the curriculum too. So more power to teachers attempting to do what can be difficult, but it's also a very rewarding part of teaching.
Honestidad y diversidad son dos principios fundamentales de la educación sexual, y es por eso que yo apoyo a los maestros, porque son parte fundamental de la educación.
Thank you.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, profesora Connell. Muchísimas gracias a todos quienes nos acompañaron desde el canal de YouTube. La verdad que ha sido un espacio más que contundente y nos vamos con muchas preguntas y con muchas puntas para seguir intercambiando. Yo les recuerdo a quienes nos están viendo que mañana a las 9 de la mañana volvemos a retomar con los grupos de trabajo, y después a las 2 de la tarde vamos a tener las mesas redondas y seguiremos con los conversatorios. Les agradezco a todos su participación, y muy especialmente, Raewyn, te agradecemos por la buena predisposición y por el entusiasmo que mostraste desde el primer momento en que te contactamos. Nos despedimos hasta mañana.
So,